morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name is John Lua. In case I haven't met you yet, I am part of the Microsoft team. My official title here at Microsoft is Global Black Belt. Belts are great for holding up pants. Today, we're going to talk about governance, so I hope you guys are ready, and I'm going to bring up a lot of old school stuff, but it's very relevant in today's conversations. Today, we're really going to talk about a product called SharePoint Advanced Management, and for folks who are not as familiar with this product, we actually built this tool prior to even any of our generative AI capabilities coming out, right? So this product launched before Copilot launched, but it was really geared to tackle some big challenges in SharePoint Online that a lot of our customers have, right? And so these big four key areas of challenges are really what we're going after, the sprawl of SharePoint sites, right? And in today's world, in terms of generative AI, the oversharing of information is top of mind for everybody, including controlling access. And then, of course, taking a look at the lifecycle management of those SharePoint sites as well is going to be a big part of this conversation. The way that SharePoint Advanced Management works is when you actually acquire the license for it, it gets enabled in your admin center where you're going to have these new capabilities where you can configure and apply into your tenancy. But the way I like to present this is typically the way I like to talk to my customers about their journey into this generative AI era, right? Whether that's using Copilot or taking a look at some of the other generative AI capabilities, or even looking at third-party generative AI capabilities, right? They're all going to have relevant challenges and problems. And really, there's going to be key big areas where we can help. And the primary area of concern for a lot of our customers is really on that oversharing scenario. And so when we think about that, we're going to dive into some of these reports here in a second. But I'm going to walk you through how I present this to my customers to really give them a good understanding of how we need to take a look at this ginormous problem sometimes, because for my customers, they can be paralyzing, right? Taking a look at governance at a whole, looking at your SharePoint environment, and depending on the size of your SharePoint environment, we could be talking about hundreds and thousands of SharePoint sites to maybe even a million SharePoint sites, right? So we want to think about this more at scale and how we can basically tackle this problem in a more of a sustainable basis. And so the first area that we typically look at is around the sprawl of the SharePoint sites, right? What can we do there? How can we help with some of this challenge? And basically, how can we put our organization in a better spot from a lifecycle perspective? And so one of the key areas that we look at or we start off with is really finding ownership of SharePoint sites. And why is that? What you're going to see here in a lot of the demos is that a lot of our controls are predicated in identifying owners for the SharePoint sites, because that's who we're going to communicate to in order to remediate some of these challenges. And so this first capability, site ownership management policy, allows you to essentially look for orphan sites within your environment, right? So not only can you look for orphan sites, we can also mandate a minimum number of site owners now within your SharePoint sites. So that way, when we run this report, not only can we get visibility into those orphan sites, but maybe those SharePoint sites that don't match the minimum requirement that we've set. Now, again, why is that important? Because a lot of our remediation steps are going to look at site ownership in order to receive communication from the admins. And so this report, again, allows you to bring back that information from an orphan perspective, but also match those site ownership minimum requirements, right? And then if your site doesn't match that or meet that, we can then email either the previous manager or the manager or the previous owner, or active members within a given SharePoint site to see if they want to take ownership or nominate somebody else as a site owner of that given SharePoint site. So it's basically going to be a newer tool that's part of SharePoint Advanced Management, but goes into those areas that we've been asking for in terms of capabilities and features to help us with managing things at scale. And so that's the site ownership policy, really important, because as we move on, the next area that we're going to attack is really the inactive SharePoint sites, right? So those are going to be things that we want to look at next. So site ownership, we've identified. What we're going to go after now is basically where are our SharePoint sites that have been inactive for either 3 months or 6 months, right? Those are going to be the two options I have. What happens in that scenario is we can perform actions on that SharePoint site. So here's how the tooling works. We can generate the report first. Similar to the site ownership, we can create a report that matches the inactive sites policy. It could be 3 months and it could be 6 months. When we say inactive, what we're looking for there is that nobody has gone to the SharePoint site to even look at a document, right? View a document itself. If the SharePoint site is connected to a Microsoft team, nobody's gone to the SharePoint site to view a document. Nobody's gone to the team messages in order to basically communicate, right? So you have those two scenarios on there. So when we basically find that site that's inactive, what we're going to do next is email that site owner, letting them know we're about to perform actions on that given SharePoint site. The actions that you have options today are going to be things like mark that site read only. Why? So we can make that site be more immutable, right? Because one of the scenarios that we want to protect those SharePoint sites from is that inactive and unattended sites are potential vectors for attacks. So we want to be able to kind of safeguard to some degree for some of those attacks. So you can mark a site read only, or you can mark a site read only for a certain given period of time, and then move that SharePoint site into our archiving solution, right? So you have the ability to do that as well. So you have those two options. What happens in that scenario essentially is that once we email those site owners, they're going to get 3 tries to essentially, or 3 contacts to see if they need to basically keep that site active. If they no longer need that site to be active, then we're going to perform the actions on that given site. So that really is how we support that inactive SharePoint site scenario. I know I saw a couple of questions here. Let me pause and just kind of go through some of these questions. For site ownership policy and inactive sites, does each user need a SAM license or just the admin? So the answer to that is actually based on our licensing for the product itself, which is that anybody who benefits or uses the tool needs to be licensed for SharePoint Advanced Management. That means if you're going to enforce a policy or run a policy that touches a SharePoint site, the members of that SharePoint site would need to be licensed as well, right? So anybody who benefits or uses the tool basically needs to be licensed. Combination of Teams and SharePoint activity. People don't realize that there's a SharePoint site behind the scene, but a lot of posting and meeting. Yes, I completely agree. Now, there is a scenario in which you might archive the SharePoint site, but you don't necessarily archive the team yet because we don't have that capability yet. So keep that in mind as well. We do support all types of SharePoint sites, whether they're modern SharePoint sites, classic SharePoint sites, or modern SharePoint sites that are connected to Teams. We can take that SharePoint site and basically archive that SharePoint site. There's some caveats and gotchas there, but we'll be more than happy to send you more information around that. All right. So now that we kind of took care of the lifecycle management piece, right? The next piece is really how can we start identifying potential areas where we have content that is overshared, right? And there's different ways to do this. There's PowerShell reports that you can run. There's old school reports that you can kind of put together, right? But it is a daunting task because even with the PowerShell reports, that report could come back with 400,000 items that match that specific condition. The question is going to be, what do you do with that much information in a report, right? How do you realistically remediate and triage those scenarios? So that's where this tooling is really going to help to some degree as well with some of that type of challenge. And one of the key areas that we're going to start off with is what we call the data access governance reports, right? So within SharePoint Advanced Management, there's 2 types of reports that you're going to get. There's what we call activity reports, and there's what we call state reports, as in current state reports. The current state reports are a little bit newer. They're going to start coming out this month. The activity reports have been there for a bit, but they have specific capabilities and scenarios that they're good for. So I'm going to start off with demoing one of these activity reports. And so the first report I'm going to demo is what we call the Everyone Except External Users report. Now, what this essentially does is it bubbles up information or items that match that condition. So when I go into the reporting tool, I can target SharePoint or I can target OneDrive. If I target SharePoint, I can basically say, show me items where everyone except external users permissioning has been used on a file or a folder, right? Once I run this report and it finishes, you're gonna see the top 100 items on the UI. You're gonna, if you download that report, you're gonna see the top 100,000 items, right, in the UI, or 100,000 sites. Once you have those sites designated, you can then trigger what we call a site access review process. That site access review process will email the site owners a new link in a new dashboard that allows them to remediate the items that are more likely potentially overshared, and then allows you to then basically send that signal that you completed the review process back to the admins themselves, right? So that's, again, going back to that site ownership. We want to get closer to the site owners themselves, because the site owners are going to know best what content could potentially be overshared. Because remember, oversharing is not a new problem. The problem that's existed for years and decades. It happened all the way back in the file share days, right? We just never had a compelling event to really fix some of these issues, because a user didn't typically search fast or fine enough where you could find some of that overshared information. But in a generative AI world, that completely changes, right? When I go prompt Copilot for a question, what Copilot's going to do is provide me an answer, and then provides me the reference to where it found its answer. In a traditional search manner, I search, I get a result back, then I had to go read through that result to find the right answer, right? Completely different workflow, and hence why a lot of my customers today are now starting to look at, how can we improve our governance? How can we do a better job of managing our content, right? Where do we need to fix areas where potential information could be overshared? So this is why this is a very popular engagement at the moment, and very popular conversation that I'm having. Now, just to give you another example of these reports, this is what we call a state report, right? So again, the current state. So in this scenario, what we're gonna do is look for items where they have a minimum of at least 1,000 permissions on that item, right? Again, why would we want to do that? We've been asked a lot by other admins, what if I just wanted to see my top items that have the most permissions on it, because chances are that might be one of those areas where it's overexposed. Now you can generate that report similar to the other scenario. I can then trigger a site access review process where we email the site owners, giving them the ability to then remediate and fix some of their issues. And then when they're finished with their remediation, send that signal back to the admin, and then we have that captured within the admin portal. So that's basically what we call the data access governance reports, and it basically shows you all those capabilities. Now, in terms of updates that are going to be coming, right, just want to make sure I throw this out there. There are going to be updates in terms of the reports. More state reports are going to be coming, right? We're basically increasing that downloaded report to 1 million lines in there, which is still going to be fairly large. So knowing that there's going to be these giant reports, right? Let me show you guys some of the things that we're going to be doing that are roadmap items to help our admins with some of these reporting tools. So one of the key areas that we're going to be looking at enhancing is really our admin's ability to basically be able to handle some of these larger reports. So one of the first enhancements that we're going to be doing by the end of the calendar year is something called Advanced AI Insights. And what this actually helps with is, as opposed to you downloading that report and having to go through that report right away, you can essentially run the AI Insights tool, and it's going to give you patterns that we're seeing on that report, as well as recommended steps to remediate some of those issues and challenges. So that's one of the new enhancements that we're leveraging AI to help our admins be more efficient in just being able to govern the environment, right? So that's one of the key areas. The other one that we announced at the M365 conference in terms of helping out with some of these reports and kind of search capabilities, right, in terms of content, is what we call AI-driven semantic matching, right? Now, this one's a little bit different. but it's fairly new. I'm super excited about it, but I haven't seen it yet. But the way it's going to work is that if you already have a SharePoint site that you've already established that has the right guardrails and policies on it, right? This is exactly the way you want to protect the rest of your sensitive SharePoint sites, but you're not necessarily sure where the rest of your sensitive content is, right? What you can do with this tooling is you can take that site that you've already established as your gold standard and make that be a reference site. Then you can upload a CSV file with a list of SharePoint sites that you want to scan and compare to your reference site on there that you established. When we scan those SharePoint sites, what we're really doing is we're reading the content inside of those other SharePoint sites, and we're matching it with the content that's in your reference site, right? So it's not necessarily just looking at labels or just looking at policies. We're literally reading the content to compare it, because if the content compares similarly to your reference site, then we're going to flag that site that we scanned to say, hey, we're seeing similar content here, but it doesn't necessarily have the right guardrails. We recommend you apply the right policies to this SharePoint site. So again, it's a newer capability. It's coming by the end of the calendar year. It's called AI semantic matching. This is going to be one of those newer features that can help with that scenario. All right. So as we're chugging along here, this is going to be one of the most important parts in terms of the conversation that we're having, because this is one of the key areas where customers want to understand and know, if I have all of these challenges, if I have some of these pitfalls, how can I get started? What are some of the controls I can look at, knowing that I got to basically spend some time maybe applying the right purview labels to my content or information protection to my content, right? What can I do to get started, and how can I get started in terms of this journey? Well, there's a number of things that you can do out of the box, of course, right? So we know that, but to be able to do things at scale is a little bit tougher. So this is where some of these controls are going to help you. And one of the first key controls is basically called restricted content discoverability. The way this capability works is it allows you to put a SharePoint site into a block list, right? Block meaning we're blocking that site from being surfaced in either enterprise search or Copilot search. And so right off the bat, we're basically removing that site from the enterprise scope. Why? To help prevent that scenario of an overexposed content, right? The whole scenario of, oh my gosh, I go put a prompt, an answer came back from a site and a document that I did not even know exists. And typically, one of the key areas of concern for a lot of my customers is legal, HR, some of these big type of sensitive SharePoint sites. So if you have concerns around those SharePoint sites and you don't trust the members to have shared the content properly, you can remove that site from the enterprise scope of your search, right? So it minimizes that first initial impact of oversharing from that perspective. Now, from an end user perspective, I can still be on the SharePoint site itself and still be able to search information. Or if I'm using Copilot, I can still point to the documents in that SharePoint site and be able to use it in my Copilot engagement and prompt, right? So it doesn't necessarily hinder me at that level. What we're trying to do, again, is just remove that extra layer of risk from an overexposed, overshared information. All right. So that's the first control, right? It's called restricted content discoverability. This next control is a little bit more advanced, and it's called restricted access control policies, right? And again, this can be applied to SharePoint and OneDrive. But the way this policy works is it allows us to bind any SharePoint site with either the original M365 group that associated with it or a security group that you designate, right? Why is that important and why does that help? So let me explain it in this way. When I have conversations with my customer, about 99.5% of the time, and I ask them, what are your concerns around the oversharing scenario? These are their concerns, right? The accidental sharing of a site, folder, or a file, the overuse of the people in the organization link, or what we call the everyone except external users permissioning, or somebody downloading it and potentially sharing it accidentally that way. So with all the different controls from a Microsoft perspective, I'm going to show you some of these controls in flight and in use, right? So the first one I'm going to show you is something called authentication context from conditional access. This is a newer type of control, but this is very relevant from a SharePoint perspective in that now you can put conditions for access down to the site layer, right? Before, with conditional access, you had to apply it at the service layer. So we would apply to all SharePoint sites. Now we can do authentication context where we can apply those conditions of access down to a specific site within your SharePoint environment. Why is that important? Because if you have a site that has sensitive information or highly confidential information, you can do things like, hey, don't access this site if it's basically being accessed on a mobile device, right? So you can basically think of it that way. But that's how authentication context works. The next policy that we can apply is then that restricted access control policy, in that if you already have a site that's looking like this, where it's bleeding information, as soon as we apply the RAC policy, we're going to bind that SharePoint site to that security group or the original M365 group associated with that site. When we do that, if the user is not a member or an owner of that group, they automatically lose access to that content, even if they got the sharing link before. So this is a quick way for you to be able to stop the bleeding and remediate a site that has been overshared, or you can go more proactively and basically apply this policy on a site and leave it on there moving forward so that you control the access that way. So I'll give you a use case in a perfect scenario where a customer is using this in the retail environment. I have a customer today who's basically a retail store who has pharmacies, right? They have specific SharePoint sites that have content for their pharmacies, but only their HIPAA employees are supposed to access those pharmacy sites, right? So in order to ensure that they abide by those compliance and make sure that there's no accidental sharing of information, what they essentially did was took those SharePoint sites and they bound them to a security group with their HIPAA employees on there. That way they can let their HIPAA employees do what they need to within that given SharePoint site, be able to share, collaborate, and work, but they can't necessarily share with somebody who's not designated as HIPAA certified, right? So that's one way you could basically leverage this control to be able to help with controlling access on the site. Let me look at the questions real quick. I know there's one that popped up from Robert. Can you do authentication context based on labels? Yes, you can actually do that based on the sensitivity labels of the SharePoint site, Robert. So I have customers today who are basically applying authentication context to sites that they deem as highly confidential. They have different rules for all those sites that they have highly confidential. Now, just continuing on, block download is a new policy that's part of SharePoint Advanced Management that we can actually enforce on any given SharePoint site now. So keep that in mind if you're thinking about the block download capability. And then you can default sensitivity labels with purview capability on that. So that will help you with those scenarios as well. So keep that in mind as well. But if you look at this traditional SharePoint site now, this is a very common scenario that I have conversations with customers all the time. This could be a mergers and acquisition site. This could be your R&D site. It could be your legal site. It could be HR, right? Now that you have the defense in-depth scenarios, you can now apply the right controls given the right type of collaboration that you're looking for on that SharePoint site. And I always say that, right? Because it's the balance of security and productivity that we're trying to achieve. Because here's what happens when it's off balance. 7 years ago, when we started Office 365, we had a lot of organizations that restricted sharing with so much rigor on it, right? And what ended up happening in that scenario is a lot of the users tried to find different ways to just accomplish the task that they had. So then shadow IT happened. And so we don't want the same thing to happen again, right? So we want to make sure you're able to deliver the productivity capabilities that the customers and the users need, but also give you, the admin and the security team, the policies and guardrails that you need to ensure that data security is applied at the content layer. So that's really kind of why we always harping around the balance of productivity and security, is that we don't want the shadow IT thing to happen again, but we want to make sure your users have both, right? From that perspective. All right. Chris has a question around authentication context. Any requirement for Defender for cloud apps to be involved? Not necessarily, Chris, in terms of the authentication context. You can do it without the cloud, the CASB part deployed. But there are specific things that you can do if you do have the CASB policies that are employed. So you could potentially do it. All right. Let me move over to the last access control and some of the other things that I have for you guys. Quick snapshot of block download, because I want to make sure you guys are able to see that capability as well in flight. So here's block download, right? Just again, to kind of reiterate, we can block download on any given SharePoint site. We can also do an exclusion. So if you needed a certain group of users still be able to download, we can do that. But this is also the same control if you have a requirement to block Teams recordings from being downloaded in your environment. You will need SharePoint Advanced Management for that, and this is the control you would use for that. So here's the block download in action. You can kind of see this as more of a typical SharePoint site would have the the download capabilities on it. But once we enforce the policy, we're going to block 3 things from that SharePoint site: downloading, printing, and syncing, right? Because all 3 of those actions pull the data back down to the local machine. So we're going to remove those capabilities from the end user themselves. So that's what you're going to see here in a second. We're going to invoke the policy on that SharePoint site. Once we invoke it, it's going to remove the ability for that user to be able to download. And it does give you a policy tip on the top as well. All right. Now, the last control I want to show you guys in terms of the access control capabilities is this one. This one is called the extended SharePoint permission with sensitivity labels. It's a handful. But just to give you an idea, the requirements for this tool, this capability to work is you have to have E5 and you have to have SharePoint Advanced Management, but there's basically a tie between the two, and it's gonna basically work dynamically. So here's the use case, right? I have a group of folks that want to collaborate, and they want to collaborate with people externally, but they want to make sure that the content is protected regardless of where it is. So in the external scenario, if the user downloads the content, they want to be able to encrypt it on the fly and protect the content with the permission and the security that's on the SharePoint site, right? So we got the SharePoint security with the SharePoint group, right, associated with it, or the security group associated with it. We want the encryption to happen when we download the content. So we got a lot of things going on, but here's how it works in flight, right? So I'm going to start off with Megan, and Megan's going to default the sensitivity label on the library and say, you know what, everything in this library is going to be confidential. Now, as she invokes that, we're going to enable this feature. So we're going to basically dynamically encrypt content if somebody copies, moves, or downloads, right? So in the case of Henry, he's going to download the content. So when he downloads this content, we're going to encrypt it in the fly. So he's going to open it up. You'll see that the encryption is taken in effect, right? It's going to tell him, hey, these are the things you can do, that the content is downloaded. Or we're going to switch back to Megan, and Megan's going to be finished with her collaboration with Henry, and she's going to kick Henry out. When she kicks Henry out, we're going to switch back to Henry and check if Henry still has access to that content. And so then this is basically what that experience is going to look like. Now that Henry gets kicked out of the group, he can't open that document anymore because the security in that document is basically tied to the group in the SharePoint site. So if you're no longer a member or an owner of that group, you can now be kicked out, basically, in terms of that piece. All right. Let me look and see if they got questions on here. Let's see. Jason has a question. Do you also need to the SAM license to prevent meeting transcriptions from being downloaded. Actually, today we don't have the transcriptions blocked. It is coming though, Jason. So yes, you will need the license, but it's not blocked at the moment. All right. Let me go to the rest of the other capabilities. The rest of these capabilities are just kind of like tie-ins in terms of other things that you can do with SharePoint Advanced Management, but it does help from that perspective, right? Just want to make sure I flash some of these capabilities for you guys. So one of the newer capabilities that we announced in terms of SharePoint Advanced Management is what we call the recent admin actions. The way this one works basically is it gives you an audit trail of your admin actions. So as you're making changes in your admin center, and let's say you want to go back and figure out what did you change 5 days ago or 7 days ago, now you have the ability to kind of see an audit or running audit trail of all the changes you made as an admin within the admin portal, just making things a little bit easier for you to be able to track back and look at the changes that you made. This other one is a really good one as well. This gives you this SharePoint change history. So more around the SharePoint site settings. And so if you had to do an investigation of a user potentially changing some of the site settings on that SharePoint site, now you can basically be more targeted, where you can target the URLs of the SharePoint site, the period of time that you want to investigate, even down to the user themselves, right? And this will produce a report for you that basically has that information. For some odd reason, my video is not working on that report. And then the last capability that's part of the SharePoint Advanced Management around some of the generative AI capabilities, right? We have a lot of customers that need to identify their sites, and they have a lot of subsidiaries, right? And this is probably a common problem that you guys are familiar with. We didn't have the ability to change the URL of a SharePoint site before, right? Now we do. And so if you actually have a need to change the URL of a SharePoint site, we now have the ability to do so. It's part of the SharePoint Advanced Management tool as well. It's called the tenant rename capability, where it now allows you to change the URL of a given SharePoint site. So if you do have subs within your group or subs within your organization, now you can use this for subs. And Pete, you are absolutely right. This is available for everybody. You can actually use it for the first 10,000 sites right out of the box. If you need more than 10,000 sites to be renamed, that's when you need SharePoint Advanced Management for the tool. All right. Any other questions? Michelle, I'm not sure how you guys do this. Do you guys do an open forum for questions, or?
Yeah, we certainly can. We usually just have the chat, but if anybody would like to come off mute, certainly take advantage of John while he's here. Think of all your scenarios that you're wishing that you would have, because I think we would also love to hear if we're on target for rolling out some of these things, or if there's something that you know that you would love to see. We'd love to hear that too.
Mm-hmm. Now, I always get this question too around archiving. So Michelle, what I'll do is let me add a little bit of the archiving conversation, because this happens a lot with my customers around some of these capabilities, right? The question that always comes up, like, okay, what is this archiving scenario from a lifecycle management? Is this something new that you guys just started, right? How does this work from that perspective? So just to let you guys know, in Ignite last year, we announced 2 different capabilities, right? There's one we called M365 Archive, the other one we called M365 Backup. They relate to the governance scenarios as it relates to content governance in your environment, in that these 2 capabilities do exactly what they sound. Archive is long-term cold storage. Backup is hot and fast, right? And designed to be backed up and restored, especially in the scenarios of compromise. But from an archiving perspective, the difference between the two is really that your active storage is active, right? That means you can access content to it right away. Your archive storage is archived because it's cold. You would have to reactivate the site back up in order to access the content. But the benefit you get of M365 Archive is that it's connected to your M365 tenancy, meaning that your compliance capabilities continue to work. e-discovery continues to work, right? We're even building an end user search that's going to be available by the end of the calendar year. But any content you move into our archiving solution also removes it from Copilot, right? So when we tell customers, hey, improve your data quality as it relates to Copilot and M365 generative AIs, right? Or remove obsolete insights, what we're really talking about there is if you move content into your archiving solution, it removes it from the lens of Copilot. Of course, if you delete the content, it removes it from the lens of Copilot too, but it's a separate option for you to be able to retain content that you got to hold for long term because of various reasons, right? Whether that's business, legal, and so forth, but have the ability to essentially have that content be accessible in case you need to at a given point in time. So it's a really good solution to have. The other benefit that you get with our archiving solution is we don't charge for archiving unless you're already over your tenant quota. Okay, so your active storage is typically 20 cents per gig per month. Archiving storage is typically 5 cents per gig per month. So there's a 75% difference in cost in terms of the two storages. But the way it works is, let's say today you have 100 terabytes of tenant quota, right? That means tomorrow, if you start moving sites into your archiving solution, and now you have active and archive sites, as long as you haven't reached past your tenant quota, we don't charge you anything for archiving, right? So this is kind of helping you with your lifecycle management. And again, it helps you with your whole generative AI journey and testing as well, right? Now, let's say in the following month, you grow by another 10 terabytes of active data, right? So now you're looking at 110. At that point, because you're exceeding your tenant quota, we're going to charge you, but we're going to charge you the cheaper costs first, right? It's going to be the archiving costs first. So it'll be 5 cents per gig in that scenario. So at that point in July, you would get a $500 bill because you exceeded your quota by 10 terabytes, right? So again, that's going to be kind of how we price the archiving solution. And that's why it really helps and lends itself well to our customers having that capability. Let me look at the questions that came up. Let me see this. How does this play into an extranet? Are these the same controls we should be looking at? Yeah, basically we can apply the policies and controls to any SharePoint site, whether it's essentially pointed internally or pointed externally. It would be the same controls. Can I still run e-discovery against SharePoint archive storage? Yes, the answer is yes to that. The only caveat today is if you have to export the data to external console, you do have to reactivate the SharePoint site back up. So keep that in mind, but running the e-discovery search is definitely doable within the archive solution. If you need to export the data and actually provide it to external console, you will have to reactivate the SharePoint back up to export the data. They are working on a more long-term solution where you won't have to do that, but it's not available yet today.
And John, I would think if you reactivate that site out of the archive tier, then if you're worried about Copilot grabbing it, then you would want to make that site free of search.
Yes. So Michelle, that's where, like, again, the combination of SharePoint Advanced Management and our other tools, right, like Archive, where if you put that restricted content discoverability policy on that SharePoint site to begin with, right, we already removed that from search. Let's say that site becomes stale, we move it into Archive, and then you bring it back up again. Well, the policy is already on top of that, Michelle, so that the policy would just honor it again. Because that's what's great about our archiving solution. It basically works natively, right? And so what I mean by that is you can go into your active site location, you can take any SharePoint site and you can move it into the archiving solution. Once you move it into the archiving solution, there's going to be a new section in your admin center called Archive Sites. That's where you can choose any site and reactivate it back up. Now, if a user hits a site that's not basically, or that is in archive, what will happen is they'll get a splash screen that says your site has been archived, and there's a button on there that says contact an admin. My customers are either wiring that button up to a ticketing system, a form, or an email, whichever you prefer, right? But basically, we put that site in archive the way exactly it is, meaning that all the permission it stays the same, the URL stays the same, the structure stays the same. So when you rehydrate that site back up, it basically comes back as is. Now, here's the other caveat that I've been telling a lot of my customers. If you're going to archive a site, that's connected to a Microsoft team, right? Make sure you archive the team as well, right? So, because Michelle, you know what happens if you basically archive the site, but not the team. If the team's still active, the users will try to upload something, it'll error out because the site has been archived at that point.
And I'm curious, just even looking at this, I see the storage. I see like 71% used on the second site. Can I go in as it's archived and just clean it, just to kind of lower my storage?
Oh yeah. So not today, not yet, Michelle. So the plan from a lifecycle management part is that a couple of things. We are going to honor anything from a retention policy perspective. So meaning that if you have SharePoint site with content and that content basically has retention policies on it, those retention policies continue to trigger, right? So let's say you have a 7-year retention policy and you move the SharePoint site 2 years into that 7-year policy. We will continue the rest of the 5 years to count the 7 years total, right? And after that policy comes, we will start deleting content if that's what the policy is set to do. So you don't even have to go back into archive for us to do that. Now, there's another scenario that customers want, which is I have stuff in archive. I want to go in and just start cleaning stuff in archive, right? They're working on a capability to give you the ability to kind of just do that, where you can start cleaning up stuff in archive without using the retention policies in that scenario, but it's not available yet.
Okay, that's going to be cool when it comes out. It also honors, while it's an archive, your security. So if you have a security group tag and you remove somebody from it, maybe they leave the company or whatever the case, it will honor that security.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, and that's the other tricky part too. If you move a SharePoint site that was connected to a team, we don't recommend you delete the M365 group because it's the same problem in that scenario, right, Michelle? You're going to have an orphan site essentially that's going to basically come back up without the right security on it. So it's going to be orphaned to some degree. So that's not something that we recommend either in terms of archiving a team site or a site that's connected to a team and then deleting that M365 group.
And is that a manual? Like say we archive a site, is there anything we're working on towards a pop-up notification to say, would you like to also archive the team? And then it will automatically do that?
Yeah, not yet. I think the goal, Michelle, so Teams is a big one, right? So for M365 backup, Teams is not available yet, but they're working on that. That's going to be the next workload. So in M365 backup, we have Exchange, OneDrive, and SharePoint as the workloads that we can do. In archive, we only really targeted SharePoint and OneDrive because Exchange has its own archive solution, right? So we only targeted those two areas. But even in the OneDrive scenario, we're like, technically each user gets 25 terabytes. So do they really need to archive? But the one thing that the customers want us to do is when they have users that leave the organization, but they have to retain the OneDrive site because that's part of their policy, that eats up active storage, right? They want to be able to archive that. So that's what the product team is working on right now.
Very cool. I think you've got maybe another question.
I got a couple of questions. Yeah. Let me look. So let me see. Yeah, I think I answered the e-discovery one. How long does it take to rehydrate? So it could take up to 24 hours, depending on the size of the site and how many files are on that site. In a typical fashion, at least the ones when we were playing around, if the site's really small, it'll come back in minutes or hours. If it is a large site, it could take up to 24 hours to come back. Let's see, except owners can delete their, yeah, that's a little bit of a, there's some things that you can do now. There are a number of things, right? So there's a couple of things I know my customers are working on or are basically kind of looking to pose as their strategy. One of the key areas that a lot of my customers are looking at is that how can we maybe do the restricted access control policy in SharePoint Advanced Management and then use Entra ID's group access review process to then fully automate kind of the end-to-end process where the admins don't have to maintain anything. You're kind of offloading the maintenance of the group and that SharePoint site to the owners of that SharePoint site, right? So that's another scenario that a lot of my customers are starting to look at in terms of, all these types of scenarios in terms of being able to support guest access or temporary access, right? If you guys have E5, some of the scenarios around that would be entitlements might be something you want to take a look at as well. That's another scenario where you can provide different access packages for your guest users, and it will expire in that scenario as well, right? So that could help you with that lifecycle management from a end user collaboration perspective. Any idea when M365 backup will be available for GCC? Man, that's a tough one. So for commercial tenants, it's supposed to go GA by July, but for GCC, I think it might be in paid public preview today, but I'm not sure when it's going to go GA. Maybe at the end of the calendar year, but I'll double check and I'll send Donald and Michelle the information around that.
Yeah, we have a lot of GCC folks that join, so we always want to make sure if we have any information that we can share it with them for sure.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's available for paid public preview. I think what we don't have today is when it's going to go GA. And from what I heard from the product team a few weeks ago, we're still on target to go GA for commercial at the end of July or by the end of July. But for GCC, I think it's more later at the calendar year.
And I'm curious, I'm going to come on camera and kind of give you a break from having to be the only one on there.
Sure.
Do you have typical scenarios where people would use backup, or are there certain industries that use backup or that are using SAM? I'm curious what you're finding in that space.
So backup's a tricky one, and that's a good one to pose, Michelle, because for the longest time, we never really recommended customers to have a backup for M365. In fact, that's the first thing out of their mouth when I have conversations with them. It's like, you guys never told us we needed backup, so why are you all of a sudden telling us that we need backup? The answer is we're not telling you need backup. What's been happening over the past couple of years, Michelle, is we've had a few customers that were basically exposed, right, through cyber attacks. And when they did try to restore from a backup solution that they use, there were a lot of challenges around the performance of the restoration, right? Because a lot of our partner solution today from a backup and recovery perspective does an export-import scenario. So when we export the data and have to shove it back in a restoration scenario, you run into the throttling scenarios of M365, right? And that's where a lot of the challenges come into play. And so because of that, that's why we built our own M365 backup solution that was really built to be inside of the tenant so we don't run into that export-import scenario. Yeah. That's why our backup solution is also available to our partners to be able to be used as part of their tooling. That's why we're working with Rubrik, we're working with Cohesity and all those companies, right? So that's the backup scenario. We still don't recommend it, but if you have, situations where, hey, that's part of your strategy, you have to basically make sure you have a failover from a ransomware perspective, or you have ingredients in your environment and you got to store that somewhere else in case something else happens to that environment, right? Then yes, get a backup solution in that scenario. Now, SAM is a funny one in that it got launched in early of 2023. And to give you some perspective, I only had maybe 2 customers purchase it at that time, right? Now, our new year started, June to July, right? Michelle, we went from maybe 2 customers using SAM to now about, a good bit of them. Like, I think we're close to 100 customers now using SAM. either
Mhm.
testing it out, piloting it, or actually purchased it, right? And a lot of the reasons why we see it happening, Michelle, are the things that I brought up, which is really that oversharing problem, right? Because
Mhm.
here's the reality. I don't care if you use G Suite, OpenText, or any other solution out there, you have oversharing problems, right?
Yep.
It's just
Yep.
common because it's a human behavior problem. And because of that, there was no compelling event that really forced a lot of our customers to do governance work because it takes time, right? And it's daunting. It's a huge environment. But now with generative AI, that's changing everything completely,
Yeah.
where there's a lot more emphasis on data privacy and security. So I become more popular now because they want to know, how can I get started by at least putting guardrails on the container, right?
Yeah. Yep.
While I work on that label at the content layer, because at the best way to protect content is really at that content layer, right? But we understand that it takes time to do that, and so hence why, let's look at other ways that we can protect the content governance in terms of all.
Right. Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I have a lot of conversations where some folks that they're like, oh my gosh, AI is going to expose data.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah,
the way that you are permissioning right now is actually exposing the data. So now it's just
right.
showing up in a different endpoint. And now's the time to, again, never too late to
Yeah,
govern your data. And so I love that. A
yeah,
couple of other questions came up.
yeah. Let me see. Is license included? No. So SharePoint Advanced Management is an add-on. The list price for it, because it's all public in terms of if you find the documentation, it's basically $3 per user per month. We do require that all your information workers typically need to be licensed for it. The frontline workers, we can actually not license because in most cases, most frontline workers never touch SharePoint, but your information workers can typically touch SharePoint in that scenario. So we do need to license them. Now, I say $3 per user per month, but I will tell you guys this: contact your account team members if you are interested in SharePoint Advanced Management, because we have a ton of deals on SharePoint Advanced Management because of its popularity around this Copilot journey, right? So make sure you to do that. The other question around syntax in the past. So is SAM one piece? Yes. So there's more rebranding that happened. The rebranding is called SharePoint Premium now. So think of SharePoint Premium as all kinds of advanced capabilities from a SharePoint perspective. But the way I would want to think about it probably is like SAM, or SharePoint Advanced Management, is just another feature or capability under the SharePoint Premium. We still have all the syntax capabilities or the document processing capabilities that's part of that SharePoint Premium family. They're basically all kind of a la carte. The only one that's per user per month at the moment is SharePoint Advanced Management. Everything else from a SharePoint Premium perspective is going to be pay as you go. Let's see, recent deal just screening over now. Oh yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of things that we are doing as well, right? In terms of making sure that we increase some of our capabilities, not just for our customers, but for internally as well. But I can tell you, Sam is one of those key areas where a lot of our customers are really looking at kind of protecting the containers to start off with, right? It seems to be a little bit, at least in my conversations with customers, it's less daunting to look at the problem that way first, then think about like the granular levels of control, right? So that's why it's become more popular in terms of the conversation I'm having today.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like even some of the labeling can be
Hmm.
more complex to get right and to
Yeah,
enable and roll out. So I've been waiting for Sam all my life, to be honest. I mean, I hopefully for everyone else on the call, like
yeah,
this is great news that finally hit our SharePoint environments that we can now have
yeah,
more control over how people are provisioning, because we can do all the training to our site
yeah,
owners, but our site owners move around. I've
yes,
done so many migrations and oh, that person isn't there anymore. I don't even know what that data is. Should we hold on to the content? Well, we must hold on to the content. So
right,
there's so much
right,
back and forth.
yeah, Yeah.
I've
Well,
experienced.
the other thing that I've heard a lot recently too, Michelle, is like the migration of content, right? Like I've
Mhm.
seen so many customers that are either centralizing content or they're migrating from on-premises into the cloud. So not only did we see growth during the pandemic, we're seeing a lot more growth as well happening after the pandemic, right? But I think part of that is kind of that AI journey that a lot of our customers are taking in that they're trying to figure out where's the best place, right? How easy is it to deploy some of these AI capabilities? And where can I extend more features or more actions for my users? And that's really why I love the Copilot part of it, because we
Mhm.
can take content and perform actions around it, right? And I think as you start seeing more and more of our generative AI capabilities that's related to SharePoint come out, like the SharePoint Copilots, for example, that's going to be even more interesting and more exciting for a lot of our customers and users, just because it's a lot of the stuff we've always wanted for SharePoint, right?
Yeah.
We just never really got the love before, but now we're getting all these new stuff now. So
Yep, agreed. You and I both been in it a long time. I think a lot of people on this call, admins, have been hoping for a report. Like, please give me a report. Let me
right,
control my environment. Yeah. So this has
right,
been fantastic. I love having you, John. This is so invaluable. And I know the product's only going to get better. Like, think of this as it's only 1 year out.
yeah,
And look at how much more it's gotten since even the last time I think I was on a call with you. So this is some great stuff. I know the GCC folks are going to be loving it if we can get it rolled out to them.
yeah.
That'd be fantastic. So thank you for your time, John. This is recorded. You can use this over and over and over again and say, hey, any questions after you watch this? Let me know.
Right, right. Well, thank you, Michelle, and thank you, team, for the time today.
You bet. Thanks so much, John.